do.
I like reading.
Okay. My name's Rita McCannon. I'm a solo practitioner lawyer in Huntsville, Alabama.
My name is Jocelyn Broman. I am a former weeple participant, competed nationals in 2006. I currently work on Capitol Hill for Senator Ben Sasse.
Now, Hank Chambers, I'm a law professor down at the University of Richmond.
All right, tell us who you are.
Thank you for allowing us to testify before you today. Your unit composes 6 juniors from East Cambridge High School. My name is Blaze Gorley.
I'm Cameron Johnson.
I'm Libby Gorzine.
I'm Jacob Starker.
I'm Kiki Katsumata-Smith.
I'm Cooper Head, and we're coached by the wonderful Adam Horos and Benjamin Langholtz, and we are Unit 3.
Okay. I'm glad we're in Unit 3. We were making sure we were in the right rooms. We've been driven like cattle all morning.
Yes.
We're going to be talking about question 1 today. Get ready, and I will, for the benefit of all the attendees, and I know you're all excited to have your folks here, we'll read the question so they'll be able to know what you're talking about. The Civil War had a greater impact on American society and the polity than any other event in the country's history. It was also the most traumatic experience endured by any generation of Americans. Do you agree or disagree with James McPherson? Why? What impact, if any, did the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments have on America? What impact, if any, did the Civil War have on the social and economic culture of America? And you may begin.
Over 600,000 lives lost, 10,000 battles fought, and 100 years of political turmoil boiled to the surface. We concur with James McPherson that the American Civil War was unequivocally the most traumatic experience in our country's history. It left backyard fields bloodstained and devastated, the federal government newly empowered, the economy poised to grow in the north and decimated in the south, and the ongoing issue of equality for millions of freed slaves unresolved. Families turned to foes, and though treaties were signed, unity was elusive, and battles continued to be fought.
Civil wars are inherently the most divisive conflicts, and the American Civil War was no exception. It split families and brother fought brother. In 1860, America's population was just over 31 million people. Of this total, 1.3 million became casualties of the Civil War, over 4% of the population. To put this value into a grim perspective, more American lives were lost during the Civil War than every other war in American history combined.
Slavery was the key dividing issue that led to the Civil War. When the 13th Amendment was ratified, it banned slavery everywhere, rather than just territories in state of rebellion. This took the intent of the Emancipation Proclamation and engraved it into our higher law. But the cost was great. Freedmen had no property, no method of self-sufficiency, and were immediately oppressed by their former white masters, both socially and economically, through black codes and sharecropping.
To address this growing oppression, the 14th Amendment was ratified. A clear definition of citizenship was established, including the protected rights a citizen has, as confirmed in U.S. v. Walton-Kennard. Yet, the effect of the Equal Protection Clause was delayed by the decisions of the slaughterhouse cases and Plessy v. Ferguson, upholding the creation and implementation of Jim Crow laws. But the ruling of Brown v. Board nearly 60 years later effectively used the Equal Protection Clause, declaring segregation of schools unconstitutional. Additionally, cases such as CBQ Railroad v. Chicago and Gillow v. New York expanded the protection of rights at the state level through the Due Process Clause and began incorporating the Bill of Rights.
The ratification of the 15th Amendment further expanded the rights of African Americans by denying states the ability to restrict the right to vote based on race. Yet these men were quickly prevented from voting through discriminatory practices such as poll taxes and literacy tests, which were upheld in U.S. v. Reese, while grandfather clauses were removed in 1915 in Gwynn v. United States. It wasn't until after the Voting Rights Act of 1965 passed when African American voter turnout began to increase. Initially, the 15th Amendment was a symbolic gesture of the path to equality, but became significantly more effective with proper legislation.
The social ramifications of the Civil War are still felt today. Badges of slavery still hold power in movements such as the voter ID laws, the prison complex, and the disparate arrest rates between African Americans and other races. Glorification of Civil War Confederates remains a divisive issue, exemplified in recent protests such as in Charlottesville. Additionally, the migration of African Americans to northern cities brought with it redlining and racial tensions. We see this today in Detroit, Michigan, one of the most segregated communities in America, due to the construction of interstate highways, which enabled white flight to the suburbs.
The Civil War also brought massive economic changes with lasting ramifications. Through the destruction of Southern infrastructure, Southern per capita income had fallen to roughly 2/3 the national level. The poor felt this the most as they are locked in a cycle of poverty that persists to this day, as 9 of the top 10 states with the highest level of poverty are southern states.
The northern economy, on the other hand, benefited greatly from the increased need for arms essential to prosecuting the first modern war, and as a result, factories and railroads sprang up everywhere. The relocation of more than 6 million African Americans from the rural South to the North, known as the Great Migration, brought a willing workforce that perpetuated urbanization and industrialization. This traumatic war forever changed the United States, economically, socially, and constitutionally. Thank you. We are now ready for your questions.
All right.
So you talked about the political changes, and you talked about the social and economic changes. Which are more important?
I would argue that some of the social changes that came around from the Civil War were the most important out of the 3 categorical changes. We've seen today several badges of slavery, such as the disparate arrest rates, higher unemployment for African Americans, as 16 states and Washington, D.C. have at least twice as high unemployment as for African Americans as their white population.
I'd argue that the economic effects of the Civil War were the most important. Before the Civil War, the South and the North were both equally competitive in terms of GDP. But after the Civil War, the South never fully regained its prominence in the United States economy as it once held. And that prominence moved out west. And so I think that with the Civil War, the South was destroyed and has never fully recovered to this day.
I would agree with my colleague, and because of the economic ramifications that we still see today, 12 of the top 15 states with the highest level of child poverty are all southern states. And out of the 4 regions in the United States, the highest level of poverty is in the southern with 16.1%.
Additionally, this shows as before the Civil War, the richest 1% in the North was much or not significantly at a disadvantage compared to the South. And after the Civil War, property value increased in the North by 55% and decreased in the South by 75%, showing that the impacts economically and the stake of wealth significantly affected the Southern economy.
And the reason for this destruction of the South was the total war policies instituted by the Union during the Civil War. General Sherman is very well known for burning the South, literally and figuratively. And he marched to the sea and destroyed most of Georgia, most of Alabama, and most of the coast.
I would agree with my colleague that the social changes were more than the economic, because even after the passing of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, African Americans still were barred their right to vote up until the Voting Rights Act of 1965. And even today, there's still a lot of discrimination. As in 2014, African Americans were incarcerated at 5 times a higher rate than white Americans.
Help me out. When you say that Sherman burned the South, did he burn it and then do what to it? Why wouldn't it have regrown?
Well, the Reconstruction policies didn't really. So the South is a commodity-based economy. Before the Civil War, it was a commodity-based economy. And after the Civil War, the South never really fully regained the economic potential it had when it used slaves. So when it burned the plantations and he burned all the Southern infrastructure, the South never really rebuilt in the same way that the North benefited from the Civil War. So the North gained prominence, and the South never really regained its prominence.
The South was also lagging in the Industrial Revolution. Because of their profits they were gaining from tobacco and cotton, they never really saw the need to industrialize. But from 1800s to 1860, the agricultural production went down from 70% to 40%.
What do you mean, or can you be more specific about the increase in the industrialization in the North versus the South? How did that happen, and why was that a benefit or an offshoot of the Civil War?
Well, many young industrialists got their start in the Civil War. John Rockefeller got his start with Standard Oil during the Civil War, helping Union railroads, and same with Vanderbilt and Carnegie Steel. They all got their start as young industrialists during the Civil War. And then railroads, infrastructure was built, and factories needed to produce all this modern equipment was built all up in the North, while the South was destroyed.
Additionally, 7/8 of immigrants coming into the United States were going into the North, which helped project the labor force immensely, and evidently was the reason why the industrialization of the North proved to be so effective.
Is any of it due to Southern governments and Southern politics?
So after the Compromise of 1877, in which the Civil War was essentially declared over by the national government, Rutherford B. Hayes was elected as president, and in exchange for his presidency, he essentially withdrew the troops from the southern states, and after that, the federal government could no longer enforce the policies that the southern states were making. And additionally, when Rutherford B. Hayes was elected, he switched the Republican Party to more of a business-driven party rather than focusing on civil rights. And so, as the troops returned to D.C. and out of the southern states, the Republicans sort of began their business-driven philosophy.
Furthermore, the Southern oligarchy wanted to maintain its status as what it was before the Civil War. So they used policies like sharecropping, and really didn't see a need to industrialize if it could keep that system in place.
And due to the fact that before the Civil War, there was the 3/5 compromise that allowed the states in the South to have more representation and allow them to enact legislation such as the Missouri Compromise of 1820 and the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850. They proved to be very prominent in the government, but after President Lincoln got office in 1860 and wasn't on the ballot in many southern states, the southern states began to realize that it began to decrease in power, and that caused their secession due to the fact that Lincoln favored many anti-slavery ideas.
And going off of that, the 14th Amendment, Section 3, may I please finish my statement? Also removed the Fugitive Compromise, which definitely limited the representation and gave them power.
Thank you.
I realized as you began to talk, it was going to be difficult for all six of you to argue with each other. You agreed with the kindly guy. I wanted to say which one, but I finally got it. What a nice presentation. Thank you all so much.
Yeah, I think y'all covered a lot of territory, and it was good. It was good stuff. You talked about a lot of the effects and some of the voting rights issues, and I thought that was pretty strong. Not sure I would go with you on all the economics, but that's okay. There can be disagreement along those lines. Just the last piece, I'm not sure whether I was hearing this correctly, but the discussion of the 3/5 clause, the elimination of the 3/5 clause gave the South more representation in Congress, not less. So just something I may have misheard that, but if I did, then that's the deal. But I thought it was a good presentation. Like I say, you covered a lot of territory, so I appreciate it.
Yeah, there is so much here. And also, I think this is the first time we've heard that the immigration in the North may have had an impact on how we talk about the differences between the North and the South. So I just want to point that out, that is something that I hadn't quite put together, and I think there's some cultural and it's economic, and I think that you guys did a good job of arguing all of those different areas when I asked you that question of what's most important, because that's an opinion-based question. So your examples in arguing your positions was excellent, so I appreciated all of that.
And if we had had 30 more seconds.
I know.
We wanted to hear it, and I don't blame you for being.
Yeah.
It's hard to know if it's okay to finish talking, and you did fine. At least it's not all Alabama's fault. I love you. Y'all just covered a whole lot of ground. It was a pleasure.
Thank you.